And I want to welcome everyone to this session of FCS at Home. We are delighted to have Dr. David Weisenhorn and Dr. Kerri Ashurst to share with us about relationship conflict. And I am going to start sharing my screen and turn it over to David. Are you first?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, you can talk and I'll get that done.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that everybody's here. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I am happy to be here, but more excited that you all are here. Today, Kerri and I will be talking about relationship conflict. And I think one of the most important points to make before we begin this conversation and this webinar is to address some of the conflict that's taking place right now across our nation. Most of what we're dealing with right now are deep-seated conflicts, specifically those within racial tensions and issues. And while today's conversation is not going to address those topics, I just want to say that we acknowledge at the university, that Kerri and I acknowledge that this is a topic that demands our attention, demands our conversation, demands our attempt to find solution and resolution. However, that will not happen today at this webinar. It's not, again, because we don't feel that it's paramount, but rather that these webinars are planned far in advance. And while Kerri and I had a small conversation and thought, is this something that we should try and add and we should touch on, I think the overall decision on that was that it's not, because we want to be able to give it the time and the effort and the attention that it deserves. And we hope to do that in the future. So if you've tuned in today in hopes that this conversation is going to address some of what you're seeing on the news, I'm afraid it might not scratch your itch. But we hope to bring something to you about that, because again, we recognize as a university that is a topic and a discussion that needs to be had, and we hope to have it soon. But to today's conversation, we're going to talk about relationship conflict. And what we'll talk about today is something that we feel applies mostly to marital relationships, dating relationships, cohabitating relationships, and even parent-child relationships. And so today we're going to talk about relationship conflict and how to make the most of it. What I hope we will do, next slide. Am I advancing that? I don't know. And one more. Perfect. So what I hope to do today is when you walk away, you'll gain some awareness. You'll see a little bit more about relationship conflict, in that it's not just happening in your relationship. It doesn't indicate that the relationship you're in is bad, because it's happening worldwide. Relationship conflict is a part of relationships, and we'll get into that, but I want to increase your awareness on that. Hopefully we'll talk about some of the things that cause conflict in our relationship. We'll talk about that, yes, there are benefits to conflict. That is not a typo. That, believe it or not, while we talk about conflict as if it's a bad word, there are some benefits that we get when we enter into conflict if it's handled and approached appropriately. And then Kerri is going to share just some very practical ways in which we can handle conflict in our very own relationships. So the next slide, we'll see right now the state of the pandemic has created a big issue. All right, it has increased conflict worldwide. Right here, we're seeing the increase in reported domestic violence cases since the lockdown. And this is by the United Nations Women, who have produced this information. And what we see is France reported within the first week 30% increase in domestic violence. Spain, 18% increase. Singapore, 33%. Cyprus, 30%. The United States, 35%. Australia reports, their Google report showed 75% increase in online searches for domestic help. Or domestic violence help, rather. China's numbers of domestic violence calls tripled according to the UN. South Africa experienced nearly 90,000 reports in the first week of their lockdown. While that is alarming, one of the, I think an important piece to note is that officials do state that on approximately 50% of abuse and domestic cases do not go reported. Meaning that if you took these numbers and you added a 50% increase, you might see what they would say would be a more realistic number as it relates to the violence. Now, I realize that when I talk about this slide here, we're talking about domestic violence, which is the most severe case of relationship conflict. And while our conversation will not be highlighting those severest cases, we'll talk on that a little bit. It is just to illustrate the fact that given the circumstances that we're spending more time in each other's presence, there's a lot more time for that friction. You add in other variables of reduced work and possibly lost jobs. You have the scare and the increase of worrying about our own personal health, dealing with possibly the deterioration of mental health issues that are occurring because of the stress. And then again, what we mentioned earlier, and then all of the things that are happening in the news, this can really create a lot of tension and it can create a lot of conflict. So if you're experiencing that in your home, the point is that it's happening everywhere. You're not alone. And so why conflict? So why is it, David? Why is it that we're having conflict? Next slide. Conflict's inevitable. It's something that a psychologist, well-known psychologist, Dr. Jordan Peterson says is that, hey, this is a part of everyday life. This is something that happens all the time. Fellow psychologist and family relations specialist, Dr. John Gottman, who has been studying relationships for over 40 years, says that 69% of conflict is perpetual, that it is inevitable, meaning there's no resolution, and that they're based on personality differences in our individual needs, and that they don't always align. And so that can create the conflict. And that what he's studied in his 40 years is what he has found is that relationships that are beneficial, that are good, that are loving and lasting, it's not that they're void of conflict, but it's rather how they handle it and approach that conflict when it arises. And so I want to say that again, it's not the avoidance or there's no negative, or there's no conflict rather, but the conflict exists. It's all about how they do it. And so when we think about people who say, oh, we just want to avoid conflict, I want to avoid conflict, I think in some ways you set yourself up for failure, because what we're going to see now is that there are benefits of conflict. And what Jordan Peterson would say is that conflict gives way to the unknown. That when we begin to explore and to talk about our needs, we present an opportunity to learn from one another. Gottman says that there's a request in every complaint, and that if we would pay attention and seek out what those requests are, if we could listen to a complaint and turn it into a request, that we would be better off, because that's what we're really doing. And he says that that there's a ratio, right? That there's a 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio that proves to be success. And I know on the slide here I say 5-to-1 negative to positive is a fail. And one of the reasons that he states this is because he says we tend to have more, we tend to focus more on the negative. That there's more negative in our lives that if there's just one thing, we'll latch onto it. And I'll take you back to your last one. I'll have you think with me to either your last conflict or maybe even the last annual review you got. If you'll think about the things how that went, my guess is that we mostly remember those negative, and we tend to latch onto it because we want to improve. Right. And so when we talk to our significant others, or we talk to our partners or our children, we need to know that we've got to really put those small nuggets of positivity in there so that we can keep the balance, so that the ebbs and flows, so that when conflict does arise, it's not as dangerous, that we can get there. What's interesting about this ratio is that Dr. Jordan Peterson says that the opposite is also true, that there's 11-to-1 ratio of positive and negative, and that's going to create a fail. He says that life should be it should be a life of goodness with a good, strong struggle in between everyone, a good fight every once in a while to help us with this positivity, not being too positive. And it's interesting, when I was working in a contract research organization, I worked with a program manager, and we were our project manager rather. And one of the things I loved about working with her is on her whiteboard, and I use this, I've said this several times, on her whiteboard she had a statement that said, if you and I agree 100% of the time, there's no need for one of us. And I think that's really driving to the point of what Jordan Peterson is talking about in that if we're constantly saying yes, we're just a yes man, right? We need some pushback because it creates growth. There's learning new perspectives. I need my wife not to agree with me all the time, because when she shares her perspective with me that's different than mine, then I grow a little bit. I can help see that. She might be able to say, hey, David, there's other ways. Maybe the children aren't responding the way that you think they are because of this. Maybe they're responding this way because of this. And that can help me kind of grow in that. It helps me to learn and provides me opportunities to identify the needs that I have, right? And so this points back to that request in every complaint, and that instead of complaining, we should just recognize and verbalize our need. And conflict gives us the opportunity to identify and ask for the things that we need. So an example of this in my relationship with my wife, and I asked her permission, so this is okay that I share this, is that there are times in our relationship that I'll be talking to her and I don't get any feedback, right? That I'm talking and I get none of the what John Gottman calls bids, right? These nonverbal and oftentimes verbal acknowledgments that we have, the uh-huhs, the nod yes, the chuckle, right? Like, oh yeah, I get that. Just those little pieces that go in, maybe a question here and there that let you know, hey, I'm listening to you, I'm paying attention. So there are times where I'll speak and there'll just be silence. My wife will be doing something else. And instead of formalizing my request, I'll toss a verbal jab at her. I'll poke her and I'll say, right, must be a boring topic, I get it. Or you don't care, right? And what happens is immediately I get a response from her, which is what I desire, but the response that I get oftentimes is not what I desire, right? Because it offends her. She says, I am listening to you. And I realize at that point that I'm just poking. And what I should do, what would be more helpful in that situation is to say, hey, Ellen, I feel like you're not listening to me because I don't hear you acknowledging me. And I could make my request, right? My request could be, Ellen, when I talk to you, I'd really like for you to acknowledge me, and whether that's verbally or non-verbally. I need that. I want to know that. What that would do is that would help us build that mutual respect, right? Because as couples, as parent-child dating relationship, cohabiting, whatever, marital relationship, we want to meet each other's needs. I mean, that is part of why we're together, is because we desire to fulfill each other. We want to work together in that. And so being able to state what my request is allows her much easier to meet that need, which should be something that she already desires to do. So therefore making it easy and benefiting when there is conflict. And so this also brings about our awareness, right? It raises our awareness. Next slide. So now we talk about the barriers to harmony. And these are the things kind of what I was mentioning, right? Blaming, shaming, and naming, right? Name calling, threats or ultimatums, negative interactions such as eye rolling, mocking, or dismissing, right? This dismissing is kind of what I was doing. I was dismissing her. I would say, oh, that's not important, or oh, you don't care, or it's just boring. I get it, right? I'm kind of dismissing her, and in so many ways creates that strife, creates that harsh return, right? Or recourse. And so poor timing, right? The content may be really good. It's just the timing at which that content comes. And I think you all probably think about a time in your relationships, and again, of when the content may have been exactly what you needed to hear, but the time at which it was told to you was not anywhere close to you being able to receive that. And then no communication, which creates a shutdown. You know, I think that a few of these, like blaming, shaming, and ultimatums, really stem from this desire to win an argument. And I think, or this idea of overpowering our companion. And I think that's what happens at times in conflict, is that when disagreements happen, we begin looking for this, I want to win. I'm going to stand firm and prove my ground. You know, Carl Rogers, who's a well-known and renowned psychologist and founder of the humanistic perspective, or psychological approach, he says that it's not just listening, but it's being oriented in a way that that the place we end up is better than the place we began. And I think that's so important to hear, that we position ourselves in these conflicts, that all I'm striving for is the betterment of us as a unit. It's not me winning. It's not me getting my way. It's us getting along. And I think when that paradigm begins to shift, that we don't feel so tied to being right or wrong. We just want to get along. And if that's the case, then I think that's that positioning that we're able to hear truth. It's about an attitude of openness to hearing what our partner's truth is. And so that brings me to the next slide. And I think this is a quote that I particularly like, and I think it helps in this perspective of the truth is sighted suddenly. So this is a quote from Anthony DeMello. He is a spiritual guru and Jesuit priest. And he's no longer with us, but he was a well-renowned individual in India. And he says that truth is sighted suddenly as a result of a certain attitude, so we could still be disagreeing with me and still cite truth. But there has to be an attitude of openness or willingness to discover something new. And I think that kind of ties into what Carl Rogers was saying. But really, I think a story, it reminds me of a story. I'm a storyteller, so bear with me. I'll tell this story and then hand it over to Kerri. But this reminds me of a story I heard from Zig Ziglar, who's an author and motivational speaker. And I heard it about a year ago. And he talks about sharing an experience of when he went to return 2 items. He gives two different experiences, but they have the same issue. He wants to return an item to a store. And the first one he tells is about a shirt he got. He got a really nice shirt as a gift, and the shirt didn't fit him. So he goes back to this retail store where the shirt was bought, and it was a very high-end retail store. And he says as he approaches, he's beginning to feel, he felt fine. He was feeling very positive about the experience. But when he got to the counter, he said he realized that things changed, because the customer service representative seemed to be a bit agitated and was very accusatory. First of all, he asked for the receipt. He felt like that he didn't actually purchase it. He felt like maybe he might have taken it. He didn't know if it actually came from the store because he didn't have a receipt. And Zig Ziglar he says, it was a gift. And then he said the gentleman went to, well, then why is it not folded properly? That it looks like you maybe have tried it on or you wore it. And the end of the story, he says he refused to return the shirt. And Zig left feeling very defeated. He felt belittled. He felt disrespected, and he didn't feel heard at all. He then tells a second story of when he went into another store to return a weed eater. A weed trimmer. And he said when he walked up to the counter, he was recalling his other experience that he had. And he said he was beginning to feel a bit trepidatious. He was intimidated a bit when he walked up. And what he found when he got to it was he found a very polite customer service. She was smiling. She was very warm, asked how she could help, was the first way that she responded. He talked to the situation, said this is no longer working. She rapidly took the piece of equipment. She went back to the back, brought him a new one, said, is there anything else I can do to help you? He said he felt so elated. He said he had no idea. He felt so elated about the experience, because here this person was that didn't have any questions about what was wrong, but was quick to address the situation. And he shares this story because he felt like this was very representative of how we should be in relationships. In that when he left that second store, he felt absolutely convinced that anytime he was going to buy whatever he could from that store because the customer relationships, if he had any problems, he was going to be able to bring it back. And I think that's a perfect example of how we should be in our relationships, is that when our partner or our spouse, our boyfriend, girlfriend, our children bring their problems to us, that instead of shutting them down and giving them a hard time and asking them why they're bringing the problems and these aren't my problems, instead trying to do the best we can to help those problems out. Because if we do that, they're more willing to bring us our problems. They're more willing to come to us and help us reach a conclusion that we can get together can be. And so now I'll pass the mic to Kerri, if you'll take it from here.
Thank you, David. And I love that story you share about Zig Ziglar, because it really hits home to all of us in some ways. I've even had a couple of personal experiences just here recently. I've purchased a couple of things from Amazon that have been defective. And one experience was very negative from the standpoint of, well, send us pictures. And, well, how do we know that, you know, we have a lot of people try to scam us. How do we know that you're telling us the truth and not just trying to get your money back and a product at the same time? And then I had a second experience recently where it was immediately, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, what can we do to make this right? And I think it's important to think about that with where I'm headed, because what that is a difference of feeling trusted or not feeling trusted in a lot of ways. It's that, you know, when I'm going into this and I feel like someone is trusting my feelings and trusting what I'm sharing with them, I'm going to be more open. Or as David just said, I'm going to be willing to keep going back to that person, that company, whatever it may be. Whereas when I go into it with someone attacking or acting defensive or wanting to win something or prove something with me, I'm very unwilling or unlikely to continue going back to that over time. So it's good stories to share, and it's good to think about things like that too. And that's where I want to start in with some of what I'm going to be talking about, which is the idea of moving from barriers to resolution. So I'll ask, if you will, everybody that's on here today, to just kind of think in your mind for a minute about a time when you had a good resolution experience. It doesn't matter who it was with, a spouse or partner, a boss or coworker, a child, a friend. Just think about a time when you had a conflict with someone, but the ending came with good resolution and everyone feeling good about it. What did that look like when that happened, when you felt like there was good resolution? And then where we're going to head from there is what some of those pieces are that help to produce that. You know, it's very easy, as David's been talking about this morning, to look at someone coming to you with a problem or an issue with you especially, and you immediately think, oh, here they go again, you know, here it comes. I'm on the defense immediately, right? And what's coming at me this time? Whereas when we can really open our minds and look at it from the standpoint of, this person cares about me enough to come to me, then it can certainly change the way the conversation flows. So a few things here that we're going to talk about that move us from barriers to resolution that are probably a part of your own personal stories you're thinking about right now. One is just simply active listening. It's absolutely vital. In some ways, active listening is as important or even more important than what we have to express ourselves. We certainly want to be able to express ourselves, but to be able to actively listen to another person, take that in, not formulate our next response, which we're all very good at times, right? Thinking about what we're going to be saying next rather than actually listening to what someone is saying to us. That active listening component can be the single most important part of anything to get over barriers and start moving toward resolution. Emotional intelligence, just that idea of paying close attention to your own emotions. It's okay to have those emotions and it's okay to express them, but keeping them in check at times, especially when someone is coming to you with something that is an initial conflict or an initial issue. And, you know, checking those in a way that helps you stay constructive, even when you're in the midst of feeling like you might have a perceived attack at you. Patience, 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 of course, right? Resolution doesn't always come immediately. And I think that's one thing that's hard for us at times in our relationships. We don't like conflict. We want to be done with it. Of course we do. And it's easy to grow impatient fast when we can't come to a resolution fast. But some people need time for a break. Some people need time to think through their next response. And at times that can be difficult. And I'm one of those people, I will fully admit it. When someone stops talking or isn't giving me that back and forth, I get offended easily, or I think, oh, well, do they not want to talk to me about this? When really the truth of it is that they might be trying to think thoughtfully, think in an emotionally intelligent way about the response in order to not have just a gut reaction that can actually end up doing lots more harm than good. So it's hard sometimes when you're met with silence, as David was saying, even about Ellen. And then, you know, David immediately kind of shuts down with some kind of a punchline back. But sometimes having someone take that break can result in moving forward eventually, rather than a gut reaction that can shut things down. Being impartial. Obviously, everything in conflict resolution has to do with, you know, the goal of, let's figure this out. Let's work on this together. When we look at anything from a perspective of winning, I want to win, or this is a competition, then it definitely shuts down anything about being impartial, doesn't it? It helps us to not be able to do the things that we need to do to cover all of the other things on this list: listening actively, being emotionally intelligent, being patient and impartial. That we need to be able to focus on what is important at stake, which is that someone is coming to us with an issue or a problem, rather than looking at it as we need to win something. And staying positive. One thing that I have never been very good at, and I will fully admit it, is in the other times, right? When we're not focusing on conflict or coming to each other with all the things we have going on in a given day and discussing those as a parent and child, or a husband and wife, or a partner with one another, that we sort of stop the communication when it comes to either the negatives or the have to conversations, right? But it's really important to think about how we can talk about the positives in between. What are the positives in our relationships, in our lives, that we can discuss and look at what we've done well? What have we resolved, like I said at the beginning of my time, that has worked well and come to good conclusions, and how can we do that again? And that open communication plays into that too. Being able to talk openly about everything, but that includes the positives. You know, activities we've even heard of before, like the compliment tree or the compliment bucket, things like that. Writing down several things that are positive about your relationship to give to a person on a birthday or an anniversary. You know, there's lots of neat ways, activities you can even do as a family or what have you, to be able to get at some of those positives that we don't always do a good job of discussing. And then David mentioned before, just that watching out for defensiveness and watching out for finger pointing. Next slide there. So continuing on in this movement from barriers to resolution, empathy, and looking at using empathy as a component of all aspects of our lives, every relationship we have in our lives, being able to take that breath, that step back sometimes, if you will, and say, what is this person's point of view? Where are they coming from? Not necessarily being able to put yourself in their shoes, because we can't always put ourselves in someone else's shoes, but being able to say, this is their story and this is their narrative, and I need to be present for that. Again, not worrying about what we're going to say next or come back with, just really being able to be present and in the moment for them. And then in the meantime, to staying calm and respectful. I love what David said earlier about hearing the need or the request rather than the complaint. I think that is such an important way to look at it. And it reframes it in a very positive way too, that helps to move toward resolution. Rather than coming at me with a complaint about me again, they're coming to me with a need or a request that shows they care enough about me to want to figure it out with me. Forgiveness, the next one on there. Being able to say, sometimes even in our worst moments, in our biggest conflicts in life, I forgive you. It can be tough. And I know even during this quarantine, my daughter and I, for example, I have a 9-year-old at home. We've had some moments where things have gotten a little bit loud and a little bit unsettled. And it's been hard for us to look at each other later and say, I'm sorry and I forgive you. But it can be such a huge piece for being able to move forward together and continue to have positive conflict resolution in the future as well. And along with that too, seeking compromise, that middle ground. Again, we oftentimes come into conflict thinking I want to win or I want to be right. I want my need to be what ends up holding golden at the end. But sometimes the compromise or the middle ground is really where the best resolutions can occur. And then being able to move past conflict without resentment. Even when you've had to maybe give up some things to seek compromise and find that middle ground, moving forward without the resentment, knowing when to let something go, knowing when to agree, sometimes to disagree, or when to concede even. There are just moments in life, let's face it, where we need to concede. And finally, just choosing our battles at times that we sometimes, when we're, especially when we're already feeling down or uncertain, like, well, you know, a lot of the feelings all of us have been having during this quarantine and not knowing what's coming one day to the next or how long we're going to be holed up in a house with other people and everything else, that there are times when we need to maybe just choose our battles. What's really important at the end of the day? And then facing conflict head on and together. We tend to run from it. It's basic human response a lot of times to not want to have conflict. It's ugly. It's not, it doesn't feel good. But when we can work on that together and say, okay, you know, this is something that's going to move us forward. And again, keeping that positive frame on it, then it can really help us. Sometimes there are bad times, obviously, right? You know, when I'm starving at the end of the day, maybe it's not the best time for us to sit down and have a really good time for active listening and forgiveness and compromise. But, you know, when we choose the right times and then we say, if we can't face this together right now and head on, we will later. We won't leave it behind. And then finally, we move into just the last piece of this, which is just some simple everyday coping mechanisms. Taking breaks. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But it can sometimes be very important, especially when it comes to big issues in some of the relationships we have in our lives. Again, we want to get those resolutions fast. We want to be done with the ugly feelings that conflict can sometimes bring up in us. But sometimes we just need to take a break or take a step back. We also need to take care of our bodies at times. We need to think about how our bodies are reacting to the stress that is inherently involved in dealing with conflict. And that also even leads into some things like thinking about abuse or toxic relationships, where, you know, if we're if our body is telling us that we're in a fight or flight state all the time and in a chronic state of stress, that we might to at minimum need to put some distance in a relationship in our lives, possibly even cutting ties completely when things become abusive. Making time to unwind. Sometimes it's very hard to do in our very, very busy lives, but taking that time, especially after you've worked through a conflict with someone, to just unwind and enjoy each other. Humor can really come into play with this. And I love what David was saying about using humor in some ways. That, you know, when you think about a time when you've been in the middle of a conflict with somebody and it's gotten ugly and it's gotten loud and everything else, and then all of a sudden humor comes in, and not humor at the other person, of course, with the other person, then all of a sudden it can break the ice, right? It can suddenly just make everyone's bodies kind of calm down, and you feel like, okay, we can move forward now. The yelling has stopped. The humor can sometimes be the greatest intervention piece in some of that. It helps us to really unwind. And then finally, they're connecting with others. Having caring and supportive relationships with people in our lives, people that we can go to sometimes when we are dealing with conflict with someone that we can talk it through with, who can maybe be a really good voice for the opposite gender or for another coworker, you know, somebody who is in our lives who can maybe give us that more objective perspective that we might not yet have been able to develop ourselves because we're still in that defensive mode. And you know, being able to look at the healthy responses. Somebody can sometimes point those out to you when emotion takes hold and you're not able to see those for yourself. But that connection to others can be so vital. And when we can work through and resolve those conflicts with someone, it does move us closer. It does enhance trust and enhance our relationships. And so I just mentioned a few minutes ago, and then David mentioned as well, that there are moments when things have just gotten to the point of where we feel like we can't cope, or we feel like we're scared, or we're fearful for our own safety. And that can become the point at which we move past trying to resolve conflict, right? And we need to work on something like a safety plan, or reaching out for ourselves if we feel like we're in imminent danger of harm to ourselves or others. So on this slide, David and I made sure to mention the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, both the phone number and the website. And then, of course, knowing if you're having an extreme emergency, to simply call 911. But the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline can be a fantastic resource to share with people, because there are going to be moments in our lives when we just feel so overwhelmed we don't know how to even begin coping, let alone move toward resolution. And the Suicide Prevention Lifeline connects you to someone whenever possible that's local to you, that's close to you. And there's also even a chat function now on there where someone can go in and chat if they don't feel comfortable being on a phone call with someone. And then also the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE. That number can be really important because it's something that somebody can have handy to be able to make a phone call if they suddenly are fearing for their own safety. But if they are in a position of where someone can overhear them, then they can also text the phrase "love is" to the number 22522 on there, and be able to get a text message through to someone without actually having to speak and have someone overhearing them that might cause a safety issue. And so, you know, those are moments, of course, when things have moved past the ability to work on resolution, right, David? The time at which you need to move your focus toward safety planning for yourself or for someone else. So I'm going to just take a break here and welcome any questions that we might have coming in.
Kerri, you do have a question on, do you have any suggestions for working with a loved one who has a hard time with forgiveness?
Ooh.
Or research study that you could recommend?
I do not right offhand, but that is an excellent question. That's a good list to look at and pull together some things. I know there are some excellent books out there on forgiveness. David, are you familiar with one or two right offhand?
I can send along a study that was done by Johns Hopkins University that talks about the rewards, health rewards specifically of forgiveness. That may be helpful. I can do that. As far as books, though, nothing is coming to mind at the moment, but I can certainly follow up with you on that.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Lynn.
It's also just a comment on here, Kerri, that you had suggested in a training that people put these phone numbers for the abuse and the suicide in their phone, because they might be able to share them if they were in a situation where they were needed. So maybe you personally, I guess, don't need them at this time, but you might be able to share them later with someone else.
Absolutely. Kay, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that can be a great idea for anyone. Mindy, would you mind going backward one slide back to those phone numbers for just a moment? I think it's great for any of us that are working in the social fields, working with people, helping others, to have those numbers handy right in our own phone so that we can bring them right up and be able to share them with someone, or even use them and call them for someone. Do we have other questions coming in?
I don't see any right now. Of course, as always, if you have questions that you want to address directly to our presenters, you can send an email to ukfcsext@uky.edu, and we will make sure to get that information to our presenters, that question that you have. If you are joining us for the first time, do put in your comment box that you're a first timer. And if you're not joining us for the first time, we're going to try something new today. We're going to get a little feedback from what's been going on. So you should see on your screen a question, which is, what is your number one takeaway from today's presentation? And if you will go to www.menti.com and enter the code 106488, then you can enter your response there, and we will all be able to see what your number one takeaway is. So feel free to go there right now. You can do that on your smart device, or you can do it on your computer. Either way, and you should be able to share your takeaway. So I'm going to do it along with you.
Mandy, it says it's not open for voting.
Oh, well, it does say that, doesn't it? Let me see. I might need to open voting. How about now? Try that.
You repeat the code.
The question is, the code is 106488. And the question is, what is your number one takeaway from today's presentation?
This is pretty neat how it brings it right up in real time like this, Mindy.
Yes, so you should be able to see, and it's going to scroll as we keep getting answers in. So it could be that someone has gotten something from this that you didn't think about, and so maybe watching some of those differences will be helpful to you. So I do hope that this has been an important experience for you today, and that you have learned something that you'll be able to share with someone else. I'm going to leave this open as long as we have things scrolling in. So feel free to continue to add. David and Kerri, if you all have any last comments to share as these results are scrolling in, feel free.
I just want to say, make sure we're all good to ourselves. This time has been so tough, and quarantine and everything else with uncertainty going on in our lives has definitely put us all to the test with our relationships and with conflict in our lives. And no matter how bad some days have been, I think it's important that we forgive ourselves and give ourselves grace at times.
Let's go.
I'm going to start the closing countdown because I think I'm seeing that we are not getting news. So in the next, you've got 1 more minute if you have something to say. And it is important to note that I can download these responses. Will not identify you in any way, but to share with our presenters so that they will know those things that you are taking away from today's presentation.
That is wonderful that you can download it, Mindy.
I know.
And once we are, I do want to remind you that we are taking a break next week. So you will not find any programming from FCS at Home next week, but we will be back again on Thursday, the 18th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Central Time. And we will be kicking off our summer series, which is entitled Facts Sizzling Summer. And David will be joining us again along with colleagues Courtney Luking and Natalie Jones. And their topic will be kicking up summer fun. So I think that you're going to find that our summer series is going to be a lot of fun. We do have 7 different themes for each week from June the 15th through August the 1st. So we're going to have a great time together this summer as well. I do want to thank David and Kerri for this really important presentation. It is timely because of everyone being at home together and also everything that's going on in the world right now. So thank you both for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, thank you. And we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks.
Take care.